He thought forcing her onto that stage would be the highlight of the night, a harmless joke to entertain a room full of powerful people. But in less than 10 minutes, that same decision would turn every eye in the ballroom against him and leave a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The Grand Aurora Ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting off polished marble floors and glasses filled with aged whiskey and champagne. Men in tailored suits and women in elegant evening gowns moved with practiced confidence, their laughter blending into the soft hum of a live string quartet playing near the stage. It was the kind of place where reputations were built quietly and destroyed even more quietly, where status was everything and appearances were carefully curated down to the smallest detail. And then there was Clara Whitmore, standing near the far wall with a simple cleaning cart, her gray uniform pressed but unremarkable, her presence almost invisible to the hundreds of guests drifting past her without a second glance. At 38, Clara had mastered the art of being unnoticed, her movements efficient, her eyes lowered just enough to avoid inviting conversation. She wiped the edge of a marble column, then adjusted a vase that no one else had noticed was slightly off-center. To them, she was just staff, part of the background, someone who existed to maintain perfection but never to be part of it. Across the room, Evelyn Carter stood at the center of attention, a well-known event host whose sharp wit and polished charisma had made her a favorite among the city's elite. Her silver dress caught the light with every movement, and her voice carried easily over the room as she entertained a small crowd with stories that always seemed to end in laughter at someone else's expense. Evelyn thrived on control, on knowing exactly how to command a room and keep every pair of eyes exactly where she wanted them. And tonight, as her gaze swept across the ballroom, it landed on Clara. There was something about the contrast that caught her attention, the stark difference between elegance and simplicity, between spotlight and shadow. Evelyn's lips curved into a subtle smile, the kind that signaled an idea forming. Moments later, her voice rang out across the room as she stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, effortlessly drawing the crowd's focus. Conversations quieted, glasses paused mid-air, and the string quartet softened their playing. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone playful yet commanding, "we've had a wonderful evening so far, but I think it's time for something a little more unexpected." A ripple of curiosity moved through the audience. Evelyn's eyes flicked toward the corner where Clara stood, and with a small, deliberate gesture, she pointed. "You there," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "Why don't you join us for a moment?" Clara froze, the cloth still in her hand, unsure if she had heard correctly. A few guests turned, following Evelyn's gaze, their expressions shifting from confusion to amusement as they realized who was being addressed. "Yes, you," Evelyn continued, her smile widening. "Come on up. Don't be shy." A soft wave of laughter spread through the room, not cruel enough to be called outright mocking, but sharp enough to sting. Clara hesitated, her heartbeat quickening as every eye seemed to settle on her at once. She wasn't supposed to be part of this. She wasn't supposed to be seen. But the room had already decided otherwise. Slowly, she set the cloth down and stepped forward, her shoes echoing faintly against the marble as she made her way toward the stage. Each step felt heavier than the last, the distance stretching longer under the weight of attention. When she reached the steps, Evelyn extended a hand as if welcoming a guest of honor, though the glint in her eyes suggested something else entirely. "Tell us," Evelyn said smoothly as Clara stepped onto the stage. "Have you ever played the piano?" The grand piano sat under the spotlight, its glossy black surface reflecting the chandelier above. Clara's gaze flickered toward it for just a second too long. Evelyn caught it instantly. "Perfect," she said, turning back to the audience with a bright, knowing smile. "Then, let's have a little performance." The laughter returned, louder this time, rolling through the room like a gentle wave. And as Clara stood there under the blinding light, surrounded by expectation and quiet judgment, something in her expression shifted ever so slightly, almost too subtle to notice, but enough to suggest that this moment was not going to unfold the way anyone expected. The room leaned in, waiting for the joke to land, completely unaware that they were about to witness something that would leave them speechless. Clara stood beneath the chandelier light as the soft laughter continued to ripple through the room, and for a moment she said nothing, her hands resting calmly at her sides while Evelyn Carter tilted her head with a look that balanced between curiosity and quiet amusement, as if she were waiting for the simplest kind of compliance, the kind that would confirm every assumption already forming in the minds of the audience. Because to them this was not a performance, it was a spectacle, a harmless diversion in an evening filled with polished conversations and carefully measured smiles. And Clara was simply the unexpected element meant to break the routine, someone safe to laugh at because she did not belong to their world, someone whose presence on that stage already felt like the punchline of a joke that had not yet been delivered. "Go on," Evelyn said lightly, gesturing toward the piano bench, her voice warm enough to seem encouraging but edged with something sharper underneath, something that suggested control. "We are all very curious to hear what you can do." A few guests chuckled again, and somewhere near the front, a man in a dark suit whispered something to his companion that made her cover her mouth as she smiled, while others leaned back in their chairs with the relaxed posture of people expecting mild entertainment at best, their attention casual, their interest fleeting, because in their minds the outcome had already been decided. Clara finally moved, her steps slow and measured as she crossed the short distance to the piano, the polished surface reflecting her figure in a way that seemed almost unfamiliar, as though she were looking at a version of herself that belonged to another life. And when she reached the bench she paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the instrument, not yet playing, not yet committing to the moment that everyone else was so eager to see unfold. The room watched her closely now, the earlier laughter fading into a quieter anticipation, because even in their amusement there was something about her stillness that did not quite match their expectations, something steady and composed that refused to fully align with the role they had assigned her. Evelyn remained just to the side, microphone lowered but her eyes fixed on Clara, studying her with a growing curiosity that she did not bother to hide, as if she were trying to understand why this simple interruption was not resolving itself as quickly as she had intended. "Whenever you are ready," she added, her tone softer now, though the faint smile remained. Clara lowered herself onto the bench, the subtle creak of the seat barely audible in the quiet that had settled across the ballroom, and for a brief second her hands hovered above the keys, not trembling, not uncertain, just still, as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. A man near the back shifted in his chair, glancing at his watch, while another guest took a sip of champagne, clearly expecting the moment to pass quickly. But then Clara closed her eyes, and the smallest change occurred in her posture, almost imperceptible, yet enough to draw a different kind of attention from those who were paying close enough attention to notice. It was not hesitation, and it was not fear. It was something quieter, something deeper, like a memory surfacing after years of being carefully set aside. Across the room, an older gentleman who had been standing near the edge of the crowd straightened slightly, his gaze sharpening as he watched her hands, as if something about the way she held them seemed familiar, though he could not yet explain why. Evelyn's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, the kind of subtle shift that would have gone unnoticed by most, but it was there, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her otherwise flawless composure. The room had not yet realized it, but the tone had begun to change, the lightness of the earlier laughter giving way to a quieter, more focused attention, and in that silence, Clara finally lowered her fingers to the keys, not striking them yet, just resting there, as if she were reconnecting with something that had been waiting patiently for this exact moment, and somewhere in that stillness, the balance of the room had already begun to shift, though no one could yet say why. For a single breath, nothing happened, and then the first notes sounded, soft and deliberate, cutting through the air with a clarity so precise it did not belong to hesitation, and the effect was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, because it was not the kind of sound produced by someone guessing their way through a melody. It was controlled, intentional, and placed exactly where it needed to be, and before anyone could process it fully, the second note followed, then the third, each one connecting seamlessly into a phrase that carried a quiet authority the room had not anticipated. A man near the front who had been leaning back casually straightened without realizing it, his glass pausing halfway to his lips, while the woman beside him lowered her smile, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to understand what she was hearing. Clara did not look at the audience. She did not look at Evelyn. She did not even open her eyes. because in that moment the ballroom no longer existed for her, replaced instead by something internal, something structured and familiar. As her fingers began to move with increasing confidence across the keys, the melody unfolding not as a performance meant to impress, but as something deeply ingrained, something remembered rather than invented. The sound grew richer, layered, each progression building naturally into the next, and with every passing second, the atmosphere in the room shifted further away from amusement and closer to something else entirely, something quieter and heavier, like realization arriving one person at a time. Evelyn Carter's expression remained composed, but the brightness in her smile had dimmed, replaced by a subtle tension around her eyes, because this was not how it was supposed to go. This was not the awkward, uncertain attempt she had expected, and though she said nothing, the way her posture stiffened betrayed the first crack in her control. Near the back of the room, the older gentleman who had been watching earlier took a slow step forward, his gaze fixed entirely on Clara's hands now, and there was recognition there, faint but growing, like a memory being pulled into focus after years of distance. The music continued to expand, no longer tentative, no longer contained, the tempo shifting with a natural ease that suggested not only skill but experience, years of repetition embedded into muscle memory, and the audience could feel it even if they could not explain it, the difference between someone trying and someone who had already mastered what they were doing. Conversations had completely stopped now, the low hum of earlier chatter replaced by a silence so complete that even the soft movement of fabric and the clink of glass seemed intrusive, and one by one, people began to lean forward, drawn in not by expectation but by something far more compelling, something they had not planned to feel. Clara's hands moved faster, then slower, then faster again, each shift precise, controlled, expressive without being exaggerated, and her face remained calm, almost distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely, somewhere far removed from the judgment that had placed her on that stage. The piece evolved into something unmistakably complex, the kind of composition that required not only technical skill but emotional understanding. And now there were no smiles left in the audience, no whispers, no quiet jokes, only attention, focused and unwavering. Evelyn took a small step back, the microphone lowering further in her hand as she watched, her earlier confidence slipping into something she could not easily define, because the situation had moved beyond her influence, beyond her control, and the realization settled in slowly but firmly. The older gentleman in the back exhaled softly, almost in disbelief, his voice barely above a whisper as he spoke to no one in particular. That is not possible. Yet his eyes never left the stage. And still, Clara played, each note landing with certainty, each phrase building towards something greater, something inevitable. And though the audience did not yet know how the performance would end, one thing had already become clear in the stillness that filled the room. This was no longer a joke, and whatever happened next would not belong to Evelyn Carter anymore. The music did not rush toward its climax. It unfolded with patience, as if every note had been waiting years for the exact moment to be heard again, and with each passing second, the weight of realization settled deeper into the room, pressing down on every assumption that had existed just minutes before, because this was no longer about whether Clara could play. That question had already been answered. This was about understanding who she truly was, and that answer was far more unsettling for those who had dismissed her so easily. Her fingers moved with an effortless precision that only comes from thousands of hours of practice, the kind that cannot be improvised or faked. And as the melody expanded into something richer and more demanding, it became impossible to ignore the truth that was unfolding in front of them. Near the front, a woman who had been quietly observing leaned forward, her expression no longer casual but intent, as if she were searching her memory for something just out of reach, while the man beside her lowered his glass completely, setting it down without looking, his attention fully captured now. The older gentleman who had stepped forward earlier moved closer still, his voice barely audible as he murmured, "I have heard this interpretation before," and there was a tremor of recognition in his tone that suggested he was not simply impressed, but deeply unsettled. On stage, Evelyn Carter remained frozen in place, the microphone now hanging loosely at her side, her earlier confidence replaced by a silence she could not disguise, because every second that Clara continued to play was another second that shifted the balance of power further away from her. And for someone who had built her identity on controlling the narrative, this loss of control was something she had never prepared for. Clara, however, seemed untouched by any of it, her expression calm, her posture steady, as if the room had disappeared entirely, replaced by a space where only the music existed. And in that space, there was no judgment, no hierarchy, no distinction between who belonged and who did not. Only the clarity of each note finding its place exactly where it was meant to be. The tempo increased subtly, the complexity deepening, and now even those with no formal understanding of music could feel the shift, the way the performance demanded attention, not through volume or spectacle, but through something far more compelling, mastery. A soft intake of breath could be heard somewhere in the audience as Clara's hands crossed fluidly over one another, executing a passage that required not only technical skill but absolute confidence. And in that moment, the last traces of doubt vanished completely, replaced by something closer to awe. The room had gone completely still now, not out of politeness, but because there was nothing left to interrupt, nothing left to question, only something to witness. Evelyn's gaze dropped briefly to the floor, then returned to Clara, and for the first time that evening, there was no performance in her expression, no carefully constructed charm, only the quiet realization that she had misjudged the situation entirely, and that realization carried a weight she could not easily escape. In the back of the room, someone whispered a name, hesitant at first, then more certain, and the older gentleman turned sharply toward the sound, his eyes widening as the connection finally clicked into place, because this was not just a talented performer. This was someone who had once stood on stages far greater than this, someone whose absence had been noticed, whose name had once carried significance in circles far beyond this ballroom. And yet, here she was, sitting at a piano she had not chosen, playing for an audience that had not deserved her, revealing nothing and everything at the same time. The final section of the piece began to take shape, the notes building toward a conclusion that felt inevitable yet impossible to predict. And as the tension rose, so did the awareness in the room that they were witnessing something rare, something that could not be repeated or recreated, something that existed only in this moment. Clara's hands moved with unwavering certainty, her expression unchanged, and when the final sequence approached, the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, suspended in a silence that no one dared to break, because now, they understood, this was never their moment to control, and it never had been. The final notes did not arrive with force, they arrived with certainty, each one placed with such deliberate precision that when the last sound faded into the air, it did not feel like an ending. It felt like something had been completed exactly as it was always meant to be, and for a moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, because the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with the weight of everything that had just been revealed without a single word being said. Clara's hands remained resting lightly on the keys for a brief second longer, as if she were allowing the final resonance to settle into the room, and then, just as quietly as she had begun, she lifted them, opened her eyes, and looked forward, not at any particular person, but through the space itself, her expression calm, unchanged, untouched by the transformation that had just taken place around her. The audience remained frozen, caught between disbelief and understanding, because what they had witnessed could no longer be explained away as coincidence or luck. It was undeniable in a way that demanded recognition whether they were ready to give it or not. Somewhere near the center of the room, a single pair of hands came together in a hesitant clap, the sound sharp against the silence, and for a fraction of a second, it seemed almost out of place, but then another followed, and another, until the room began to shift, the applause building slowly at first, then with growing intensity, not forced, not polite, but genuine, rising in waves that filled the ballroom and echoed against the marble and glass. People stood, not because they had been prompted, but because they felt compelled to, drawn upward by something they could not quite articulate, and as the applause swelled, it became clear that the moment no longer belonged to the setting, to the event, or to the expectations that had defined it earlier in the evening. It belonged entirely to the woman who had just stepped beyond all of it without effort or acknowledgement. Evelyn Carter did not clap at first, her hands still at her sides, the microphone forgotten, as she watched the reaction unfold around her, watched the same audience that had laughed moments ago now rise in admiration. And there was a stillness in her posture that spoke louder than any words she might have tried to say, because for the first time, she had nothing to control, nothing to guide, nothing to reshape, only a reality that stood firmly outside of her influence. The older gentleman who had moved closer to the stage now stepped forward fully, his expression no longer uncertain but resolute, and as the applause continued, he spoke quietly, though his voice carried enough to reach those nearest to him. "That is Clara Whitmore," he said, and the name seemed to ripple outward, repeated softly from one person to another. Recognition spreading in uneven waves as fragments of memory aligned with what they had just witnessed. "She performed at Carnegie Hall," he added, his tone steady, certain, and now the shift in the room became complete, because this was no longer just a moment of surprise. It was a revelation, a correction of everything they thought they understood about the woman standing on that stage. Clara did not react to the applause. She did not bow. She did not acknowledge the recognition. She simply stood, then turned, stepping away from the piano with the same quiet composure she had carried all evening, as if the performance had been nothing more than a brief interruption in her routine. The applause followed her, growing louder as she moved, but she did not slow, did not look back, and when she reached the edge of the stage, she stepped down with the same measured calm, returning to the floor where she had stood before, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The laughter was gone, replaced by a silence that lingered beneath the applause, a deeper understanding that settled into the room and refused to leave. Evelyn finally raised her hands, clapping slowly now, her expression composed once more, but different, altered by something she could not fully conceal, because the moment had already passed beyond her reach, and no amount of control could reclaim it. And as Clara walked back toward the edge of the ballroom, unnoticed no longer, the truth remained suspended in the air, clear and undeniable, that respect does not come from appearance, and it does not wait for permission. It reveals itself, quietly, completely, and without apology. The applause did not fade immediately. It lingered, rolling through the ballroom in uneven waves as if the room itself was reluctant to let go of what had just happened. But Clara Whitmore did not turn back. She did not pause to acknowledge it. She simply continued walking with the same steady rhythm she had carried all evening, her steps quiet against the marble floor as she returned to the edge of the space where she had once been invisible, and yet now every movement drew attention, every glance followed her, not with curiosity, but with something far deeper, something closer to respect, though many in that room were still struggling to understand how quickly their perception had shifted. Conversations began to return, but they were not the same as before, voices lowered, words more careful, as if the atmosphere itself had changed its rules without warning, and near the center of the room, small groups formed, people leaning toward one another, asking quiet questions, repeating the name they had just heard as though saying it aloud might help them make sense of it. "Clara Whitmore," someone whispered again, and another responded with a faint nod, their expression thoughtful, almost unsettled, because recognition carried with it an uncomfortable truth that they had been standing in the presence of someone extraordinary and had chosen to see nothing at all. At the stage, Evelyn Carter finally lifted the microphone again, though for a moment she did not speak, her composure carefully reconstructed, her posture once again aligned with the confidence that had defined her earlier. But something subtle had changed, something that could not be fully masked, because control once lost does not return in quite the same form. "Well," she said at last, her voice measured, almost softer than before. "That was unexpected." And a few restrained chuckles followed, though they carried none of the earlier ease, none of the sharp edge of amusement, because now the audience understood that the joke had never belonged to Clara. Evelyn paused, scanning the room, and for the first time that evening, she did not command attention, she waited for it, and that difference, though small, was unmistakable. Across the ballroom, the older gentleman who had spoken earlier moved toward Clara, his steps deliberate, his expression respectful, and when he reached her, He did not raise his voice. He did not draw attention. He simply inclined his head slightly and said, "It has been many years, Miss Whitmore," his tone carrying the quiet acknowledgement of someone who understood exactly what had just taken place. Clara met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, almost distant, and she offered a small nod, nothing more, because there was no need for explanation, no need for recognition to be confirmed. The moment had already spoken for itself. Nearby, a younger woman who had watched the entire performance approached hesitantly, her voice uncertain as she said, "I had no idea." And Clara's response was gentle, steady. "You were not supposed to." And there was no bitterness in her words, only a simple truth that settled softly between them. The ballroom continued to shift around her, the energy no longer centered on spectacle, but on reflection, as if each person present had been quietly confronted with something they could not ignore, something that asked more of them than they had expected to give. Evelyn, still on stage, lowered the microphone again. Her role in the evening now altered in a way she could not reverse, because the narrative had moved beyond her, beyond performance, beyond control, and into something far more real. Clara adjusted the edge of her sleeve, the same small, precise movement she had made earlier when no one was watching, and then she reached for her cleaning card, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, as if she were simply returning to the task she had never truly left. But now, no one looked away. No one dismissed her presence. And as the soft sound of the wheels moved across the marble once more, a quiet understanding settled over the room, one that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it was already clear in the stillness that followed her, that dignity does not demand attention. It does not announce itself. It waits. And when it is revealed, it changes everything. The ballroom did not return to what it had been before, no matter how the music resumed or how the conversations attempted to rebuild themselves, because something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by laughter or polite distraction. And as Clara Whitmore continued her quiet work along the edges of the room, there was an unmistakable change in the way people moved around her, in the way their eyes followed her without the pretense of indifference they had worn so easily earlier in the evening. A server paused briefly as she passed, offering a small, respectful nod that Clara acknowledged with the faintest incline of her head, and nearby, two guests who had been speaking in low tones fell silent as she moved between them, their conversation forgotten as they watched her go, not out of curiosity, but out of something closer to recognition, the kind that arrives too late but stays long enough to matter. At the center of the room, Evelyn Carter stood once more beneath the chandelier light, her presence still commanding, but no longer unquestioned, and though she continued her role, introducing the next segment of the evening with practiced ease, there was a subtle hesitation in her voice, a slight pause between sentences that had not been there before, because even she could feel the difference, the invisible shift in authority that no script could recover. The audience listened, but not in the same way. Their attention divided now, part of it anchored to the stage, part of it lingering elsewhere, drawn repeatedly toward the quiet figure who had redefined the entire evening without asking for it. Near the far side of the ballroom, the older gentleman remained in conversation with a small group who had gathered around him, his voice low but steady as he spoke about Clara with a certainty that carried weight, recounting performances from years past, halls filled with standing ovations, critics who had once described her interpretations as something rare, something unforgettable, and with each detail, the story expanded, filling the gaps left by their earlier assumptions, reshaping the narrative they had so quickly constructed. "She disappeared," he said at one point, his tone thoughtful, almost reverent, just when everyone expected her to become one of the greats. And the silence that followed his words was not one of confusion, but of reflection, as those listening began to understand that what they had witnessed was not a sudden miracle, but the quiet return of something that had never truly vanished. Clara, unaware or perhaps simply uninterested in the growing conversation, continued her work with the same steady focus, adjusting a table setting, aligning a chair, restoring order in small, precise ways that mirrored the control she had displayed at the piano. And there was something profoundly consistent in that, something that did not seek recognition because it did not require it. A young man approached her cautiously, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful respect, and after a brief hesitation, he said, "That was incredible," his voice sincere, unguarded, and Clara paused just long enough to meet his eyes before responding quietly. "It was just music." And then she continued on, leaving him standing there with a realization he could not quite put into words. Across the room, Evelyn's gaze drifted toward Clara once more, lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. And though her expression remained composed, there was a depth to it now, a recognition that went beyond performance, because for the first time that evening, she was not observing someone beneath her, she was acknowledging someone beyond her reach. The music in the ballroom carried on. Conversations slowly regained their rhythm, and the evening continued as it was meant to. But beneath it all, there remained a quiet understanding, shared but unspoken, that something rare had passed through that room and left its mark, not through force, not through spectacle, but through a simple, undeniable truth revealed at exactly the right moment. And as Clara Whitmore moved quietly through the space, unnoticed no longer, the lesson lingered in the air around her, steady and unyielding, that true mastery does not demand attention, it transforms it. The evening continued, but it no longer moved with the same effortless rhythm it had carried before, because beneath the polished conversations and carefully measured laughter, there was a quiet tension that had not been there at the start, a subtle awareness that something real had interrupted the illusion everyone had so comfortably maintained. And as the music played on and glasses were refilled, the presence of Clara Whitmore lingered in every corner of the ballroom like an unspoken question no one could fully ignore. Near the stage, Evelyn Carter adjusted her posture once more, her voice returning to its familiar cadence as she guided the program forward, introducing speakers and transitions with the same practiced elegance that had defined her career. Yet there was a difference in how the room responded, a slight delay in attention, a fraction of hesitation in the applause, as if the audience had begun to see her not as the unquestioned center of the evening, but as just another part of it. And for someone who had built her identity on control, on shaping perception with precision, that shift, however subtle, was impossible to overlook. Her gaze drifted again toward the edges of the room, toward Clara, who now stood near a long table adjusting the placement of silverware with the same quiet focus she had always shown, her movements unchanged, her demeanor untouched by the transformation unfolding around her. And it was that contrast that made the moment linger, the fact that nothing about Clara had altered, and yet everything around her had. A small group of guests approached her cautiously, their earlier confidence replaced by a careful respect, and one of them, a woman in a dark blue gown, spoke softly. "You should not be working here." The words meant as a compliment, though they carried an unintended assumption, and Clara paused briefly, her hand resting on the edge of the table before she replied. "I am exactly where I need to be," her voice calm, steady, leaving no room for interpretation, and the woman nodded slowly, unsure how to respond, because the answer did not fit the narrative she had expected. Across the room, the older gentleman continued speaking with those gathered around him, elaborating on Clara's past with a clarity that carried both admiration and quiet disbelief, recounting the precision of her performances, the way critics had once described her interpretations as transformative, and as his words spread, so did the understanding, reaching those who had not witnessed the performance directly, reshaping the perception of the entire evening in ways that could not be undone. Evelyn listened from a distance, her expression composed, but her silence spoke volumes, because the story being told now was not hers to control, not hers to shape, and for the first time, she was not the one guiding the narrative, she was simply part of it. The realization settled in slowly, not as a dramatic shift, but as a quiet acknowledgement that lingered beneath every word she spoke, beneath every glance she cast toward the room. Clara, meanwhile, finished aligning the final setting and stepped back, her eyes scanning the table with the same attention to detail she had always applied, and then she moved on, her presence steady, unhurried, as if the evening had not asked anything extraordinary of her at all. A young server watched her pass, his expression thoughtful, and as she moved beyond him, he straightened slightly, adjusting his posture in a way that mirrored the subtle changes happening throughout the room, small shifts that added up to something larger, something more permanent than the event itself. The music swelled again, filling the space with a familiar warmth, but it could not erase what had already been revealed. It could only exist alongside it. And as the night carried on, the difference remained, quiet but undeniable, like a truth that once seen could never be unseen. Evelyn took a final glance toward Clara, her eyes steady, her expression composed. But beneath it all there was something new, something she had not carried before, a recognition not of defeat, but of understanding, because the moment that had slipped beyond her control had not diminished her. It had simply shown her something she had not been willing to see. And as Clara Whitmore continued her quiet work along the edges of the ballroom, no longer invisible, no longer dismissed, the room itself seemed to adjust around her, as if acknowledging a presence that had always been there, waiting patiently for the moment it would no longer be overlooked. The night began to draw toward its quiet conclusion, not with a grand announcement or a dramatic finale, but with a gradual softening of energy, the kind that settles naturally after something meaningful has taken place. And as the final pieces of music played and the last rounds of conversation unfolded, there was an unspoken understanding shared among those in the ballroom that this evening would not be remembered for its schedule, its speeches, or its carefully planned moments, but for something entirely unplanned, something that had revealed itself without warning and left a lasting impression that no one could easily explain. Clara Whitmore moved toward the far end of the room, her cleaning cart now lighter, her tasks nearly complete, and though her role remained unchanged in appearance, the space around her felt different, no longer dismissive, no longer indifferent, but attentive in a way that did not intrude, as if the room itself had learned how to acknowledge her presence without disturbing it. A few guests offered quiet nods as she passed, small gestures of respect that required no words, and Clara returned them with the same calm composure she had carried all evening, neither seeking nor avoiding the attention, simply accepting it as it came. Near the stage, Evelyn Carter stood for what would be her final address of the night, the microphone steady in her hand, her posture once again aligned with the confidence that had defined her career. But there was a difference now, a subtle shift in tone, in pacing, in the way she chose her words, as if each sentence carried a greater awareness than before. "Thank you all for being part of this evening," she said, her voice clear, measured, and though the words were familiar, the meaning behind them felt more grounded, less performative, because for the first time, she was not speaking to maintain control, she was speaking to acknowledge something real. Her gaze moved briefly across the room and, for a moment, rested on Clara, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with recognition, and then she continued, finishing her remarks with a quiet professionalism that did not seek applause, and yet received it anyway, though softer, more thoughtful than before. The crowd began to disperse slowly, conversations turning toward departures, coats being collected, final handshakes exchanged, but even as people prepared to leave, there was a lingering sense that something unfinished remained, not in the event itself, but in the thoughts each person carried with them, questions that would follow them beyond the ballroom and into whatever came next. The older gentleman who had recognized Clara earlier approached her once more, this time with a simple, respectful nod, and though he said nothing, the acknowledgement was complete in its silence, a recognition that required no further explanation. Clara inclined her head slightly in return, her expression steady, and then she reached for the handle of her cart, turning toward the service corridor that led away from the main hall. The bright lights of the ballroom faded behind her as she moved into the quieter space beyond, where the sounds of the evening softened into distant echoes, and for the first time since she had stepped onto the stage, the world around her returned to stillness. She paused briefly, her hand resting on the cart, and in that moment, there was no audience, no expectation, no contrast between who she had been and who she was, only a quiet sense of continuity, as if nothing had been lost and nothing needed to be reclaimed. Then, with the same calm certainty that had defined her every movement, she continued forward, disappearing into the hallway without ceremony, without acknowledgement, leaving behind a room that would not soon forget what it had witnessed. And long after the doors had closed and the lights had dimmed, the truth remained, carried quietly in the minds of those who had been there, that greatness does not announce itself, It does not compete for attention. It simply exists, waiting for the moment when it can no longer be ignored. And when that moment comes, it does not ask for recognition. It changes the way the world sees everything that follows.